My name is Sarah Mitchell, and at 32, I became the youngest woman ever promoted to general in the United States Army. But before I tell you how I went from being laughed at by my own family for enlisting as an 18-year-old college dropout to commanding 15,000 soldiers and changing military protocol forever, let me take you back to where it all began. A small town in Ohio where everyone thought they knew exactly what my future should look like. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Millbrook, Ohio, population 8,400, wasn't exactly what you'd call inspiring. My father, Robert Mitchell, owned the only hardware store on Main Street, a business his grandfather had started in 1952. The faded Mitchell & Sons hardware sign hanging over the entrance told the story of 3 generations of men who believed in practical work, steady customers, and keeping your head down. My mother, Linda Mitchell, taught 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary, the same school I had attended, where she'd been shaping young minds for over 20 years with the patience of a saint and the organizational skills of a military commander, though she'd never see the irony in that comparison. Our house sat on Maple Street, a modest 2-story colonial with white siding and green shutters that my father repainted every 3 years like clockwork. The American flag hanging from our front porch wasn't there for show. Dad was a Vietnam veteran who'd served 2 tours before coming home to take over the family business. He never talked much about his service, but the Purple Heart in his bedroom dresser drawer and the way he still woke up at 0500 every morning told their own story. My older brother, David, was everything my parents had hoped for in a son. Captain of the high school football team, valedictorian, full scholarship to Ohio State University, where he was studying pre-med. At 20, he was already halfway through his undergraduate degree with plans to become a surgeon. Family dinners were filled with discussions about his grades, his research opportunities, and his bright future in medicine. David was the golden child, and honestly, he deserved it. He worked harder than anyone I knew and never complained about the pressure of being perfect. Then there was me, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, born 3 years after David, and from day one, I was different. While David spent afternoons studying, I was outside climbing trees, building forts, and getting into the kind of trouble that made my mother sigh and my father shake his head. In a town where girls were expected to be interested in cheerleading, shopping, and planning for college, I was the kid who asked my father to teach me how to change a car's oil and begged him to let me help with inventory at the hardware store. School was complicated, not because I wasn't smart, my grades were solid, mostly A's and B's, but because I was restless. Sitting in classroom after classroom, listening to teachers talk about subjects that felt disconnected from anything real, made me feel like I was suffocating. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, constantly reminded me that with my GPA, I could get into a good state school and study something practical for young women, like education or nursing. The assumption that my future was predetermined based on my gender and zip code made my skin crawl. What nobody understood, not even my family, was that I had been fascinated by military history since I was 12. It started when I found a box of my grandfather's World War II memorabilia in our attic, letters from the Pacific Theater, photographs of him with his unit, and a worn copy of The Art of War that he'd somehow acquired during his service. I spent hours reading those letters, imagining what it must have been like to lead men in impossible situations, to make split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. From there, my interest expanded. I devoured books about Alexander the Great, Napoleon, Patton, and every female military leader I could find information about. Joan of Arc wasn't just a historical figure to me. She was proof that women could lead armies and change the course of history. I learned about Captain Molly Pitcher, who took over her husband's cannon during the Revolutionary War, and Colonel Ruby Bradley, who survived Japanese imprisonment during World War II and became one of the most decorated women in military history. My bedroom walls were covered with maps, timelines, and diagrams of famous battles. While my classmates had posters of movie stars and musicians, I had a detailed breakdown of the D-Day invasion and a timeline of the Battle of Gettysburg. My parents thought it was a phase, something I'd grow out of once I developed normal teenage interests. During my junior year of high school, a Army recruiter named Sergeant First Class James Rodriguez came to speak at our school. Most students treated it as a free period, chatting with friends or doing homework for other classes. But I hung on every word. Sergeant Rodriguez talked about leadership development, advanced training opportunities, and the chance to serve something bigger than yourself. When he mentioned that the Army would pay for college while you served, I felt something click into place. This price? After his presentation, I approached him with a dozen questions. What were the requirements for officer training? How did promotion systems work? What opportunities existed for women in combat roles? Sergeant Rodriguez seemed surprised by my knowledge and the depth of my questions. He gave me his card and told me to call if I was serious about learning more. That night at dinner, I mentioned the recruiter's visit. My family's reaction was immediate and unanimous. "The military isn't for girls from families like ours," my mother said, not unkindly, but with the certainty of someone who believed she was protecting me from making a terrible mistake. "You're smart, Sarah. You could study anything you want in college." My father was more direct. "I've seen what war does to people. You have opportunities your mother and I never had. Why would you throw that away?" David, home for the weekend from Ohio State, tried to be diplomatic. "Sarah, you're talking about giving up 4 years of college for what? To follow orders from people who might not be as smart as you? You could study international relations or political science if you're interested in military strategy." Their concern came from love, but it felt like they were talking about a completely different person. They saw the military as a limitation, a sacrifice of potential. I saw it as the only path that felt authentic to who I was. The idea of sitting in lecture halls for 4 more years, accumulating debt while studying theories that might never be applied, felt like a prison sentence. Over the following weeks, I called Sergeant Rodriguez and began learning about different military occupational specialties. I took the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery and scored in the 98th percentile, qualifying for virtually any position in the Army. The recruiter was impressed but warned me that my family's opposition would be a significant challenge. "Most successful soldiers have support systems," he explained during one of our meetings at the local library. "Family that understands the commitment and sacrifice involved. If your parents are actively against this choice, it's going to make everything harder." But the more I learned, the more convinced I became that this was my path. The Army offered something that college couldn't: immediate responsibility, real leadership opportunities, and the chance to prove myself in an environment where performance mattered more than background or expectations. My senior year became a battleground. College applications sat on my desk half completed, while I secretly gathered information about enlistment. My parents arranged meetings with college advisors, scheduled campus visits, and constantly emphasized the opportunities I was throwing away by even considering the military. The tension came to a head during Christmas dinner of my senior year. Extended family had gathered, aunts, uncles, cousins, and the conversation inevitably turned to future plans. When my Aunt Margaret asked about my college plans, I finally told the truth. "I'm planning to enlist in the Army after graduation." The silence that followed was deafening. Then everyone started talking at once. My grandmother, who'd lived through World War II, declared that war was no place for young ladies. My uncle, a successful businessman, launched into a lecture about wasting my potential. My cousins looked at me like I'd announced plans to join a circus. But the words that cut deepest came from my own father. "Sarah, I've seen what the military does to people. You're too smart and too good for that life. Don't throw away everything we've worked to give you." That night, lying in my childhood bedroom surrounded by my military history books and battle maps, I made my decision. I was 18 years old, legally an adult, and I was going to enlist with or without my family's blessing. The path they wanted for me, college, a safe career, a predictable life in a small town, felt like dying a slow death. I needed something that would challenge every part of who I was, something that would prove that a girl from Millbrook, Ohio could achieve something extraordinary. 3 months later, I walked across the stage at my high school graduation knowing that in 6 weeks, I'd be leaving for basic combat training at Fort Moore, Georgia. My parents attended the ceremony, smiling and taking pictures, but the tension was unmistakable. They loved me, but they couldn't understand why I was choosing what they saw as such a difficult path when easier options existed. The night before I left for basic training, my father knocked on my bedroom door. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking around at the packed boxes and empty walls. "I hope you know what you're doing, Sarah," he said quietly. "I hope this makes you happy." "It's not about happiness, Dad," I replied. "It's about becoming who I'm supposed to be." He nodded, though I could tell he didn't really understand. None of them did. They saw a young woman making an impulsive decision that would derail her future. I saw the beginning of everything I'd been working toward my entire life, even when I hadn't fully understood what that was. As I drove away from Millbrook the next morning, watching my hometown disappear in the rearview mirror, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Complete certainty that I was heading in the right direction. Everyone thought I was crazy for enlisting, for giving up the comfortable, predictable path they'd mapped out for me. They had no idea that within 14 years, I'd be making decisions that would affect national security, leading thousands of soldiers, and proving that sometimes the craziest decision is the one that changes everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Fort Moore, Georgia in July felt like stepping into a furnace. The humidity hit me the moment I stepped off the bus, and I understood immediately why drill sergeants looked like they'd been carved from stone. Everything soft gets burned away in that heat. As we lined up for our first formation, I looked around at my fellow recruits and realized I was one of only 12 women in a company of 180 soldiers. The ratio didn't intimidate me. If anything, it felt familiar. I'd been outnumbered my entire life. Drill Sergeant Martinez stood before us like a force of nature. At 5'6", she wasn't particularly tall, but her presence filled the entire parade ground. 20-year veteran, Ranger qualified, and rumored to have completed more combat deployments than most of the male drill sergeants on base. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of authority that came from leading soldiers through real firefights, not just training exercises. "You think you know what tough is?" she announced during our first evening formation. "You think your high school football coach was hard? Your daddy was demanding? Your part-time job was challenging? You don't know anything yet. But you will." The first week broke half our company. Recruits who talked big during processing suddenly found themselves calling home, begging their parents to help them find a way out. Physical training started at 0430, followed by chow, then 12 hours of weapons training, combat skills, field exercises, and classroom instruction. Lights out came at 2100, giving us barely enough time to clean gear, prepare uniforms, and maybe write a letter home before collapsing into our bunks. I thrived. Every morning when reveille sounded, I was already awake, boots laced, uniform squared away. During PT, while other recruits struggled through push-ups and sit-ups, I found myself energized by the challenge. The obstacle course that left others gasping became my favorite part of the day. For the first time in my life, I was in an environment where the standards were clear, the expectations were high, and performance was the only thing that mattered. My bunkmate, Jennifer Walsh from Detroit, struggled more than most. A college graduate with a degree in social work, she'd enlisted for the educational benefits and loan forgiveness programs. Smart, well-meaning, but completely unprepared for the physical and mental demands of military training. While I was helping her master weapons disassembly at night, she was tutoring me through the more academic portions of our military history courses. "You're different from the others," she told me one evening, as we cleaned our M4 rifles for the third time that day. "Most of us are here because we need something. College money, job training, a way out of our hometowns. You're here because you want to be here. The drill sergeants see it too." She was right about the drill sergeants noticing. By week 3, Drill Sergeant Martinez had begun giving me additional responsibilities: squad leader positions during field exercises, point person for equipment accountability, informal leadership of our bay during barracks inspections. The attention wasn't always welcome. It meant higher expectations and more scrutiny from both instructors and fellow recruits. Some soldiers resented what they saw as favoritism. Marcus Thompson, a recruit from Alabama who'd expected to dominate based on his high school wrestling background, made several comments about, quote, teachers' pets and, quote, girls getting special treatment. The tension came to a head during a particularly grueling field exercise in Week 6. We were practicing squad-level tactical movements in the Georgia pine forests, carrying full combat loads through swampy terrain in 95-degree heat. Thompson had been designated as squad leader for the exercise, and his poor decision-making had gotten us lost twice and earned us collective punishment from the drill sergeants. When he tried to blame our navigation failures on my questioning his authority, I'd had enough. Thompson, I said, stopping our squad in a small clearing, your authority comes from your position, not your ego. We're lost because you refused to check the map when I suggested it 20 minutes ago. Either lead effectively or pass the responsibility to someone who can. The confrontation lasted only seconds, but it established something crucial. When Drill Sergeant Martinez appeared moments later, having observed the entire exchange, she relieved Thompson of command and handed me the squad leader position for the remainder of the exercise. We completed the mission 40 minutes ahead of schedule. That evening, Drill Sergeant Martinez pulled me aside for what I expected to be a counseling session about challenging authority. Instead, she asked me a question that would change everything. Mitchell, what's your plan after basic training? What military occupational specialty are you considering? I'd been planning to enter as a human resources specialist, a safe choice that would give me administrative experience and keep me away from combat roles that might limit my advancement opportunities. It was practical, reasonable, and completely wrong for who I was becoming. I've been thinking about military intelligence, I admitted. Or maybe infantry, if women are allowed in combat roles by the time I'm ready. Drill Sergeant Martinez studied me for a long moment. You know what I see when I watch you, Mitchell? I see someone who understands that leadership isn't about being the loudest person in the room. It's about making everyone around you better. That's rare. She continued, I'm going to make some calls. There's a program you should know about, Officer Candidate School. They take exceptional enlisted personnel and fast-track them through commissioning. It's brutal, and the washout rate is over 60%, but if you're serious about military leadership, it's the path that leads where you want to go, Officer Candidate School. I'd heard whispers about it, the program that could take a high school graduate and turn them into a commissioned officer in just over a year of intensive training. The idea was both terrifying and exactly what I'd been looking for without knowing it existed. The remaining weeks of basic training took on new urgency. Every PT test, every field exercise, every leadership position became preparation for something bigger. I pushed myself harder, studied longer, and began to understand that excellence wasn't just about meeting standards. It was about exceeding them so consistently that higher standards became expected. During our graduation ceremony, my parents and David made the trip to Georgia. I could see them in the stands, still uncertain about my choices, but proud of what they were witnessing. The 18-year-old who'd left Millbrook 6 months earlier had been replaced by someone who carried herself differently, spoke with new confidence, and radiated the kind of quiet competence that comes from being tested and not breaking. After the ceremony, Drill Sergeant Martinez approached my family. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, she said, your daughter is the finest soldier I've trained in 8 years of drill instruction. If she continues on her current trajectory, she's going to accomplish things that will make your entire family proud. My father, the Vietnam veteran who tried to talk me out of enlisting, looked at me with something I'd never seen before. Not just love, but respect for the choices I'd made. 2 weeks later, I received orders for Officer Candidate School at Fort Moore. The letter came with a warning. OCS had a 64% attrition rate. Candidates were expected to demonstrate not just physical fitness and tactical knowledge, but the emotional resilience and decision-making ability required to lead soldiers in combat. Failure meant returning to enlisted ranks or, in some cases, separation from the Army entirely. The night before I left for OCS, I called home. My mother answered, and for the first time since I'd enlisted, she didn't try to convince me to come home. Sarah, she said, your father and I have been talking. We may not have understood your choice initially, but we can see what the military is doing for you. You're becoming the person you were always meant to be. Officer Candidate School made basic training look like summer camp. 14 weeks of the most intensive leadership development I could have imagined, designed to identify and eliminate anyone who couldn't handle the pressure of commissioned officer responsibility. Our days started at 04:00 and ended well after midnight, filled with tactical exercises, academic coursework, and leadership challenges that pushed every candidate to their breaking point. The academic portion covered everything from military law and logistics to international relations and strategic planning. For someone who'd barely tolerated high school classroom learning, I found myself fascinated by the complexity of military operations and the intellectual challenges of leadership at scale. These weren't theoretical discussions. They were practical preparations for making decisions that would affect real soldiers' lives. Physical standards were higher than basic training, but the mental challenges were what separated those who stayed from those who left. Every week, we lost candidates who couldn't handle the stress, the responsibility, or the constant evaluation. Some were physically strong but lacked decision-making ability under pressure. Others were intellectually capable but couldn't inspire confidence in their subordinates. I found my element in the tactical leadership exercises. While other candidates struggled to balance competing priorities, mission accomplishment, troop welfare, resource management, I discovered an intuitive understanding of how to optimize all three simultaneously. The military history I'd studied as a teenager provided context for understanding how successful leaders had handled similar challenges throughout history. My evaluations consistently ranked in the top 5% of our class. More importantly, I began to understand what separated good officers from great ones. The ability to see several moves ahead, to anticipate problems before they became crises, and to maintain calm decision-making when everything around you was chaos. The defining moment came during our final field exercise, a week-long operation where we rotated through leadership positions while conducting simulated combat missions. As the acting company commander for 48 hours, I was responsible for planning and executing a complex multi-phase operation involving 3 platoons, air support coordination, and medical evacuation scenarios. The exercise was designed to overwhelm us. Equipment failures, communication breakdowns, simulated casualties, and constantly changing mission parameters created the kind of chaos that reveals whether someone can actually lead under pressure. While other candidates became increasingly frantic as problems mounted, I found myself becoming calmer and more focused. By the end of those 48 hours, we had completed every mission objective ahead of schedule, with 0 safety violations and the highest efficiency rating recorded during that training cycle. The senior instructor, Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, pulled me aside afterward. "Mitchell," she said, "in 15 years of evaluating OCS candidates, I've rarely seen someone demonstrate such natural command presence. You don't just give orders. You create an environment where people want to perform at their best. That's the difference between managers and leaders." Graduation from Officer Candidate School came with the gold bars of a second lieutenant, an assignment to the 101st Airborne Division at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. As I stood in formation, taking the oath of commissioned officers, I thought about everyone who had doubted this path: my family, my high school guidance counselor, even myself during the hardest moments of training. But I also thought about Drill Sergeant Martinez, who had seen potential I didn't know I possessed, and Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who had helped me understand that leadership was both an art and a science that could be developed through dedication and study. At 20 years old, I was now responsible for leading a platoon of 30 soldiers, most of whom were older and more experienced than I was. The real test wasn't behind me. It was just beginning. Everything I'd learned so far had been preparation for the moment when I would be responsible for real soldiers conducting real missions with real consequences. As I packed my belongings for the move to Fort Campbell, I found a letter that had arrived that morning. It was from Jennifer Walsh, my former bunkmate from basic training, who had completed her own military occupational specialty training and was now stationed in Germany. "Sarah," she wrote, "I wanted you to know that everything you told me about finding your calling was true. I'm not a warrior like you, but the military taught me things about myself I never would have discovered otherwise. Thank you for showing me that different doesn't mean wrong. It just means you're meant for something specific. Different didn't mean wrong." As I drove toward my first real assignment as a commissioned officer, those words echoed in my mind. Everyone had called me crazy for choosing this path, but I was beginning to understand that the best decisions often look impossible until you've proven them right. Fort Campbell, Kentucky, home of the 101st Airborne Division, sprawled across the Tennessee-Kentucky border like a small city dedicated entirely to the art of warfare. The moment I drove through the main gate, past the massive eagle sculpture that served as the division's symbol, I felt the weight of history and expectation. This was where legends like Easy Company had trained during World War II, where the modern concept of air mobility had been perfected, and where I would learn whether everything I'd accomplished so far had prepared me for the reality of leading soldiers. My assignment was to Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 327th Infantry Regiment, the Above the Rest Battalion, with a combat lineage stretching back to the Pacific Theater of World War II. As I walked into the company headquarters on my first morning, carrying my orders and trying to project confidence I wasn't entirely sure I felt, I met Captain Michael Rodriguez, the company commander who would become both my first real mentor and the person who would teach me that leadership in peacetime was fundamentally different from leadership in combat. Captain Rodriguez was 32, a West Point graduate who'd already completed 2 combat deployments to Afghanistan. He had the kind of quiet competence that came from making life-and-death decisions under fire, and his first words to me established the tone for everything that would follow. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he said, looking up from a stack of personnel files, "I've read your OCS evaluations. Impressive scores, excellent recommendations, top 5% of your class. None of that matters now. Your soldiers don't care about your test scores. They care about whether you can make decisions that keep them alive and help them accomplish the mission. Everything else is just paperwork." He assigned me to 1st Platoon, 32 soldiers whose ages ranged from 18 to 35, representing every background imaginable. Staff Sergeant James Wilson, my platoon sergeant, was a 12-year veteran from rural Tennessee who'd served multiple combat tours and possessed the kind of practical military knowledge that couldn't be taught in any school. During our first private meeting, he laid out the reality of platoon leadership with brutal honesty. "Ma'am," he said, "these soldiers have been together for 8 months. They've got their own way of doing things, their own internal dynamics, and they're going to test you in ways that have nothing to do with what you learned at OCS. Some of them are older than you, most have more time in service, and all of them are wondering whether a 20-year-old female officer can actually lead them when things get serious." The testing began immediately. During my first platoon formation, I noticed that several soldiers' uniforms were just slightly off regulation. Boots not quite polished to standard, name tapes positioned a fraction of an inch too high, subtle defiances designed to see whether I would notice and, more importantly, how I would respond. It was a classic challenge to new leadership, and my response would set the tone for everything that followed. Instead of calling out individual soldiers publicly, I made a mental note of every discrepancy and addressed each one privately during the day. By 1,700 hours, I had spoken individually with every soldier whose uniform hadn't met standards, explaining exactly what needed to be corrected and why attention to detail in small things translated to reliability in larger matters. The next morning, every uniform was perfect. Sergeant Wilson nodded approvingly after that first formation. "Good call, ma'am. You established standards without humiliating anyone. They respect that." The real challenges began during our first major training exercise, a month-long rotation at the Joint Readiness Training Center at Fort Polk, Louisiana. JRTC was designed to simulate combat conditions as realistically as possible, with opposing forces, live artillery, and scenarios that pushed units to their operational limits. For my platoon, it would be our final evaluation before deployment to Afghanistan. The Louisiana swamps in October were brutal. Oppressive humidity, insects that seemed designed by nature to make life miserable, and terrain that turned every movement into a physical challenge. Our mission was to conduct counterinsurgency operations in a simulated Afghan village, complete with role players acting as local nationals, and an opposing force that employed realistic insurgent tactics. 3 days into the exercise, everything went wrong simultaneously. Our communications equipment failed during a complex multi-platoon operation, separating us from higher command and adjacent units. Simulated IED explosions killed 2 of my soldiers and wounded 3 others, requiring immediate medical evacuation procedures. To make matters worse, our resupply convoy was ambushed, leaving us with limited ammunition and no food for the next 18 hours. While other platoons in our company struggled with similar scenarios, often requiring intervention from observer controllers to prevent complete mission failure, my platoon adapted quickly. The military history I'd studied as a teenager provided context for understanding how successful units had handled communication breakdowns and supply shortages throughout history. More importantly, the leadership principles I'd internalized during OCS helped me prioritize competing demands while maintaining unit cohesion. I split the platoon into 3 teams: one to establish security and maintain our defensive perimeter, another to conduct the medical evacuation simulation, and a third to continue the primary mission using hand signals and predetermined rally points to coordinate movement. By rotating soldiers through different responsibilities, everyone remained engaged, and the mission continued despite multiple complications. The exercise controller, a major who'd been observing our operations, later told Captain Rodriguez that our platoon had demonstrated exceptional adaptability and leadership under pressure. More importantly, my soldiers had begun to trust my decision-making ability under stress. That trust would be tested sooner than anyone expected. 2 weeks after returning from JRTC, the battalion received deployment orders for Afghanistan. We would be part of a surge operation designed to disrupt insurgent networks in Kandahar province, one of the most kinetic areas of operation in the entire theater. Our deployment date was set for January, giving us 3 months to complete pre-deployment training and prepare mentally for combat operations. The pre-deployment training intensified everything we'd been doing. Urban warfare exercises, improvised explosive device recognition, cultural sensitivity training, and advanced weapons systems all became part of our daily routine. But the most significant change was in the soldiers themselves. The knowledge that we would soon be conducting real operations against a real enemy focused everyone's attention in ways that training exercises never could. I used those 3 months to study everything available about our area of operations: intelligence reports, after-action reviews from previous units, cultural assessments, and terrain analysis. I wanted to understand not just the tactical situation, but the broader strategic context of what we were trying to accomplish. The more I learned, the more I realized that successful counterinsurgency operations required a completely different approach to leadership than conventional warfare. In December, 1 month before deployment, I received news that would change my perspective on military service forever. My brother David called to tell me that our father had suffered a heart attack. He was stable, recovering in the hospital, but the incident reminded me of something I'd been trying not to think about. People at home had lives that continued regardless of my military obligations. When I called the hospital to speak with my father, his voice was weaker than I'd ever heard it, but his words were stronger. "Sarah," he said, "I want you to know something. I've been reading about what your unit is preparing for, about where you're going. I was wrong to try to talk you out of this. You're doing something important, something that matters. I'm proud of you." The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but it resolved something that had been weighing on me for 2 years. My family finally understood that my choice hadn't been about rejecting their values, but about expressing them in a different way. Our deployment to Afghanistan began with a 20-hour flight that took us from Kentucky to Kyrgyzstan to Kandahar Airfield, a sprawling forward operating base that served as the logistical hub for southern Afghanistan operations. The moment we stepped off the aircraft, the reality of our situation became immediately apparent. The sound of outgoing artillery, the sight of helicopters conducting medical evacuations, and the knowledge that every person on base was a legitimate target for enemy forces created an atmosphere unlike anything I'd experienced. Our forward operating base, FOB Wilson, was located 40 kilometers south of Kandahar city in an area known for frequent insurgent activity. The base itself was a collection of concrete barriers, prefabricated buildings, and defensive positions surrounded by multiple layers of security. Living conditions were Spartana Euro, shared sleeping quarters, communal dining facilities, and limited recreational opportunities. But comfort wasn't the priority. Effectiveness was. My platoon's area of operations covered 6 villages and approximately 200 square kilometers of agricultural land, irrigation canals, and historical sites that provided countless opportunities for insurgent concealment. Our mission was to work with Afghan National Army units and local police to identify and eliminate insurgent networks while building relationships with village elders and community leaders. The complexity of the mission became apparent during our first patrol. Walking through a village where every face was potentially friendly, neutral, or hostile required a completely different mindset than anything we trained for. Children who might be innocent bystanders could also be spotters for insurgent forces. Village elders who seemed cooperative might be providing information to multiple sides. Every decision carried consequences that extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations. During our 3rd week in country, those theoretical challenges became deadly real. My platoon was conducting a joint patrol with Afghan National Army soldiers when we encountered our first improvised explosive device. The explosion killed one of our Afghan partners and severely wounded one of my soldiers, Specialist Kevin Murphy from Oregon, a 22-year-old who joined the Army to pay for college and had planned to become a teacher after his enlistment ended. The medical evacuation procedure we'd practiced dozens of times during training became a life-and-death race against time. While my soldiers established security and called for helicopter support, I worked with our medic to stabilize Murphy's injuries and coordinate with the evacuation team. 27 minutes later, a medevac helicopter landed under covering fire from Apache gunships, and Murphy was evacuated to a combat support hospital. That night, after completing after-action reports and ensuring my soldiers had processed what had happened, I sat alone in my quarters and confronted the reality of combat leadership for the first time. The decision-making I'd excelled at during training exercises now carried the weight of real consequences. Soldiers under my command could be killed or wounded based on choices I made. The academic understanding of leadership I'd developed over 2 years of military education was now being tested in the most serious way possible. 3 days later, I received word that Specialist Murphy would survive his injuries, though his military career was over. He sent a message through the Red Cross, thanking the platoon for saving his life, and asking me to tell the soldiers that he was proud to have served with them. The message reinforced something Captain Rodriguez had told me during our first meeting. Soldiers don't follow officers because of rank or authority. They follow leaders who demonstrate genuine care for their welfare and competence under pressure. Over the following months, my platoon conducted over 50 combat patrols, participated in 3 major operations against insurgent strongholds, and worked with village leaders to establish security improvements that reduced insurgent activity in our area by over 60%. More importantly, we accomplished all of this while maintaining unit cohesion and bringing every soldier home alive. The deployment taught me lessons about leadership that no classroom or training exercise could have provided. I learned that effective decision-making under pressure wasn't about having perfect information, but about analyzing available data quickly and accepting responsibility for the consequences. I learned that soldiers would follow leaders who demonstrated competence, integrity, and genuine concern for their welfare, regardless of age, gender, or background. Most significantly, I learned that the military history I'd studied as a teenager had provided me with a framework for understanding how successful leaders throughout history had handled similar challenges. The tactical principles used by successful commanders from Alexander the Great to modern special operations forces weren't just historical curiosities. They were practical tools for solving contemporary problems. When our deployment ended after 12 months, my platoon had earned a reputation throughout the battalion for effectiveness and professionalism. More importantly, every soldier who had deployed with us returned home safely, though several carried physical and emotional scars that would last long after our tour ended. Captain Rodriguez's evaluation of my performance included words that would prove prophetic. Lieutenant Mitchell has demonstrated exceptional leadership ability under the most challenging circumstances. Her tactical competence, decision-making under pressure, and ability to inspire confidence in subordinates suggest significant potential for future command positions. She should be considered for accelerated promotion and advanced military education at the earliest opportunity. At 22 years old, I had commanded soldiers in combat, made decisions that affected real lives, and proven that the crazy decision to enlist instead of going to college had been the beginning of something extraordinary. But I was about to discover that everything I'd accomplished so far was just preparation for challenges that would test not just my leadership ability but my willingness to challenge the entire military establishment when necessary. Returning from Afghanistan felt like stepping into a different world. Fort Campbell in spring looked exactly the same buildings, the same parade grounds, the same mountains of paperwork that defined peacetime military operations. But everything felt different, because I was different. Combat had stripped away theoretical concepts and replaced them with hard-earned knowledge about what actually worked when lives were on the line. My homecoming was marked by an unexpected ceremony. Colonel Patricia Stevens, the new battalion commander who had replaced our previous commander during our deployment, called me into her office 3 days after our return. Colonel Stevens was a legend in airborne circles, the first woman to command an airborne battalion in combat, holder of 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart, and someone whose reputation for developing junior officers was matched only by her intolerance for mediocrity. "Lieutenant Mitchell," she began, studying a thick folder on her desk, "your deployment evaluations make for interesting reading. Captain Rodriguez rated you as the most effective platoon leader he's worked with in 8 years of command. Your soldiers' feedback is unanimous in praising your tactical competence and leadership under pressure. The battalion's operations officer specifically requested that you be considered for immediate company command, which is unusual for a first lieutenant with only 2 years of service." She leaned back in her chair, fixing me with the kind of direct gaze that suggested this conversation would determine my future trajectory. "I've been authorized to offer you 2 options. Option 1, promotion to captain and immediate assignment as a company commander here at Campbell. You'd be the youngest company commander in the division, with responsibility for 120 soldiers and their families. It's a significant opportunity, but it would keep you in the conventional infantry world." The first option was extraordinary. Command at the company level typically required 4 to 6 years of service and specific career development milestones. Being offered such responsibility at 22 was recognition of exceptional performance, but I sensed there was more coming. "Option 2, Colonel Stevens continued, is more complicated but potentially more significant for your long-term development. The Army War College has a fellowship program that sends promising young officers to civilian graduate schools for accelerated education in strategic studies. Upon completion, fellows are assigned to high-level staff positions in the Pentagon, combatant commands, or policy development roles. The program typically selects majors with 8 to 10 years of service. They want to interview you." The Army War College Fellowship was something I'd never considered, partly because I'd assumed it was reserved for officers much senior to me, and partly because I'd been focused on tactical leadership rather than strategic planning. But the opportunity to study at the highest levels of military education while gaining exposure to policy development was unprecedented for someone at my rank. "There's a third element to consider," Colonel Stevens added. "Intelligence suggests that military operations over the next decade will require officers who understand both conventional warfare and emerging threats, cyber operations, information warfare, and asymmetric conflicts that don't fit traditional military models. The officers who develop expertise in these areas early will shape how the Army evolves." The decision required careful consideration. Company command would provide immediate leadership responsibility and keep me on a traditional career path toward battalion and potentially brigade command. The fellowship program offered intellectual development and exposure to strategic planning, but might delay my return to operational assignments. That evening, I called Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, my former instructor from Officer Candidate School, who had been promoted and was now serving at the Army's Training and Doctrine Command. Her perspective proved invaluable. "Sarah," she said, "you've already proven you can lead soldiers in combat. That foundation will always be there. What you need now is breadth of understanding about how military operations fit into larger strategic contexts. The fellowship program will expose you to thinking at levels that most officers never experience." She continued, "The Army is changing rapidly. The conflicts we'll face in the next 20 years won't look like Afghanistan or Iraq. They'll require officers who can think strategically about complex problems while maintaining tactical competence. You have an opportunity to position yourself at the forefront of that evolution." 2 weeks later, I found myself in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, being interviewed by a panel of colonels and civilian academics for the Army War College Fellowship. The interview covered everything from my tactical experiences in Afghanistan to my thoughts on emerging security challenges, my academic interests, and my long-term career goals. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the fellowship program director and a former Defense Department policy analyst, asked the question that would define my next 2 years. Lieutenant Mitchell, how do you see the relationship between tactical excellence and strategic understanding? How does your experience leading soldiers in combat inform your thinking about national security policy? The question allowed me to synthesize everything I'd learned over the previous 4 years. Ma'am, I replied, tactical operations are meaningless without strategic context. In Afghanistan, every patrol we conducted was supposed to support larger objectives, building relationships with local populations, denying territory to insurgent forces, and ultimately creating conditions for political reconciliation. But those connections weren't always clear to soldiers on the ground. I continued, developing my argument in real time. I believe effective military leaders need to understand not just how to accomplish missions, but why those missions matter in broader contexts. Strategic education doesn't diminish tactical competence. It provides the framework for understanding when and how to apply tactical skills most effectively. The panel exchanged glances that suggested my answer had hit its mark. 6 weeks later, I received notification that I'd been selected for the fellowship program and would be attending Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs to pursue a master's degree in strategic studies and international security. The transition from Fort Campbell to Manhattan was jarring. Columbia's campus, with its neoclassical architecture and diverse student body, represented an academic environment completely different from military education. My classmates included State Department officials, CIA analysts, journalists, and international students pursuing careers in diplomacy and policy analysis. For the first time since enlisting, I was surrounded by people who viewed military service as just one of many career options, rather than a calling that defined their identity. The academic rigor was unlike anything I'd experienced. Courses in international relations theory, security studies, and policy analysis required a completely different type of intellectual engagement than military education. Instead of learning how to accomplish specific missions, I was studying why nations chose particular strategies, how domestic politics influenced foreign policy decisions, and how technological changes were reshaping the nature of conflict itself. Professor David Chen, who taught my course on emerging security challenges, became an informal mentor who helped me understand how my military experience provided unique insights into academic discussions about warfare and strategy. During office hours, he encouraged me to write papers that bridged the gap between theoretical frameworks and practical military applications. Your perspective is valuable precisely because it's different, he explained. Most of my students understand strategy in abstract terms. You've implemented strategy at the tactical level and seen how theory translates into practice. That combination of academic rigor and practical experience is rare. My master's thesis examined how small unit leadership principles could be applied to strategic planning processes, essentially arguing that the decision-making frameworks that worked for platoon leaders under stress could be adapted for policymakers dealing with complex international crises. The research required extensive interviews with military leaders, policy analysts, and academic experts, providing me with a network of contacts throughout the national security establishment. During my second year at Columbia, I received an unexpected phone call from Colonel Stevens. "Sarah," she said, "I need to ask you about your post-graduation plans. There's an opportunity that might interest you, but it would require some flexibility in your thinking about career progression." The opportunity was assignment to the Pentagon's Strategic Planning Division, where I would work directly for Brigadier General Patricia Morrison, who was developing new concepts for military operations in contested environments. The position was typically filled by majors with significantly more experience, but General Morrison had specifically requested an officer with recent combat experience and advanced strategic education. "You'd be working on some of the most sensitive and forward-thinking military planning in the Department of Defense," Colonel Stevens explained. The projects you'd be involved with could influence how the Army conducts operations for the next decade. It's high-visibility work with exceptional development opportunities, but it's also high pressure with very little tolerance for mistakes. The Pentagon assignment represented exactly the kind of strategic-level exposure I'd hoped the fellowship program would provide. More importantly, it would allow me to apply academic learning to practical military planning while working alongside some of the Army's most innovative thinkers. 3 months later, I graduated from Columbia with distinction and a thesis that was selected for publication in the journal Strategic Studies Quarterly. The publication was significant not just for my career, but because it established me as someone who could contribute to academic discussions about military affairs while maintaining credibility as a combat-experienced officer. My parents attended the Columbia graduation ceremony, their pride evident as I crossed the stage to receive my degree. The contrast with my high school graduation, when they'd been worried about my decision to enlist, was striking. My father, now fully recovered from his heart attack, told me afterward, "Sarah, I finally understand what you were trying to tell us years ago. You weren't running away from opportunities. You were running towards something bigger than any of us could have imagined." The Pentagon assignment began in September, and walking into the Strategic Planning Division felt like entering the nerve center of American military power. The offices were filled with maps displaying global military deployments, secure communication systems connecting to commanders worldwide, and briefing materials covering every conceivable security challenge facing the United States. Brigadier General Morrison was exactly what I'd expected from her reputation: intellectually brilliant, operationally experienced, and completely focused on developing military capabilities for future conflicts. During our first meeting, she outlined my responsibilities with characteristic directness. "Captain Mitchell," she began, noting my promotion to captain that had come with the Pentagon assignment, "you're here because you represent something the Army needs more of: officers who combine tactical competence with strategic understanding. The projects you'll work on involve developing operational concepts for conflicts that don't fit traditional military models." She continued, "You'll be part of a small team examining how changes in technology, international law, and geopolitical dynamics are reshaping the nature of warfare. Your job is to help translate strategic concepts into practical operational approaches that commanders can actually implement." The work was unlike anything I'd experienced. Instead of focusing on immediate tactical problems, I was analyzing how demographic changes in potential adversary nations might affect their military capabilities 20 years in the future. I studied how emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and autonomous weapons systems could change the fundamental nature of military operations. I examined how climate change might create new types of conflicts requiring entirely different military responses. Most challenging and rewarding, I worked on developing training programs that would prepare military leaders for decision-making in environments where traditional rules of engagement didn't apply. The project drew directly on my combat experience in Afghanistan, where the most difficult challenges had involved distinguishing between legitimate military targets and civilian populations in complex urban environments. 6 months into the Pentagon assignment, General Morrison called me into her office for what I expected to be a routine progress review. Instead, she presented me with an opportunity that would accelerate my career in ways I couldn't have anticipated. "Sarah," she said, "the Secretary of Defense has approved a new initiative to identify and develop exceptional junior officers for accelerated promotion and increased responsibility. Based on your performance here and your overall record, you've been selected for the program. If you accept, you would be promoted to major 2 years ahead of schedule and assigned to command a battalion-level training unit responsible for developing new tactical concepts." The offer was extraordinary. Battalion command was typically a lieutenant colonel position requiring 15 to 18 years of service. Being offered such responsibility at 25, with only 7 years of service, was virtually unprecedented. But with the opportunity came expectations that would test every aspect of my leadership development. "There's one more thing," General Morrison added. "This assignment would make you the youngest battalion commander in the active Army. The visibility will be intense, both positive and negative. Some people will question whether you've earned the position, regardless of your qualifications. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" As I considered her question, I thought back to the 18-year-old who had left Millbrook, Ohio, determined to prove that choosing the military over college wasn't crazy. Every step of my career had involved proving myself to people who initially doubted my capabilities. This would be the biggest test yet, but it was also exactly the kind of challenge I'd been preparing for since the day I decided to enlist. "Yes, ma'am," I replied. "I'm ready." 3 weeks later, I was promoted to major in a ceremony attended by my parents, Colonel Stevens and Lieutenant Colonel Hayes. As the new rank was pinned on my uniform, I realized that the crazy decision to enlist 7 years earlier had put me on a trajectory that was about to make me one of the youngest battalion commanders in Army history. But the real test wasn't behind me. It was just beginning. Fort Benning, Georgia, in the sweltering heat of July, felt like returning to my roots, but with responsibilities that would have been unimaginable 7 years earlier. The 1st Battalion, 29th Infantry Regiment, We Lead the Way, was a specialized training unit responsible for developing and testing new tactical concepts before they were implemented across the entire Army. As I drove through the main gate for the first time as battalion commander, I carried the weight of history and the burden of proving that age and gender were irrelevant when measured against competence and dedication. The battalion consisted of 650 soldiers, including 4 company commanders who were all older than me, a command sergeant major with 22 years of experience, and a staff of seasoned professionals who had collectively served in every major military operation since the Gulf War. Walking into the battalion headquarters on my first morning, I understood that every person in the building would be evaluating whether a 25-year-old major could effectively lead an organization responsible for shaping the future of Army training. Command Sergeant Major Robert Thompson was waiting in my office when I arrived at 0630. At 43, he was a career infantryman who had earned his reputation leading soldiers through some of the most intense combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. His presence filled the room, not through physical intimidation, but through the quiet confidence that came from 2 decades of making critical decisions under pressure. "Ma'am," he said, rising as I entered, "I wanted to speak with you privately before we begin the change of command process. I've served under 12 different battalion commanders in my career. Some were brilliant tacticians, others were gifted administrators. A few were natural leaders who could inspire soldiers to achieve things they didn't think possible. The best ones understood that effective command requires combining all 3 qualities, while never forgetting that our fundamental responsibility is developing soldiers who can win in combat." He paused, studying my reaction. "I've read your file, ma'am. Your combat record, your academic achievements, your Pentagon assignments. All impressive, but leading a training battalion is different from anything you've done before. We're not just executing missions. We're creating the doctrine and procedures that other units will use when their lives depend on getting it right." The weight of his words settled over me as I realized this assignment would require proving myself not just as a leader, but as an innovator capable of anticipating future military requirements. "Sergeant Major," I replied, "I understand the magnitude of what we're responsible for. I also understand that my success depends entirely on the expertise and dedication of soldiers like you, who have the experience I'm still developing." The change of command ceremony took place the following week, with my parents, Colonel Stevens, and General Morrison in attendance. As I assumed responsibility for the battalion in front of 650 soldiers and their families, I felt the convergence of everything that had brought me to this moment. The decision to enlist instead of attending college, the challenges of basic training and OCS, the lessons learned during combat deployment, the strategic education at Columbia, and the exposure to high-level military planning at the Pentagon. My first priority was understanding the battalion's current mission and capabilities. The 1st Battalion 29th Infantry was tasked with developing training programs for 3 critical areas: urban warfare in complex environments, integration of advanced technology into small unit operations, and leadership development for multinational military operations. Each area represented challenges that traditional military training hadn't fully addressed. The urban warfare program was responding to lessons learned from recent operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other conflicts where military forces operated in densely populated areas with complex civilian military dynamics. Traditional training focused on conventional battlefield scenarios, but modern conflicts increasingly required soldiers to make split-second decisions about rules of engagement, civilian protection, and intelligence gathering in environments where enemies deliberately blended with non-combatant populations. Captain Elena Rodriguez, the officer responsible for urban warfare development, had served 3 combat tours and possessed deep understanding of the challenges we were trying to address. During our first detailed planning session, she outlined the fundamental problem we faced. "Ma'am," she explained, "current training gives soldiers technical skills, weapons handling, tactical movement, communication procedures, but it doesn't adequately prepare them for the decision-making complexity of modern operations." In Iraq, I watched excellent soldiers struggle, not because they lacked tactical competence, but because they hadn't been trained to process multiple streams of information quickly while maintaining situational awareness and making ethical decisions under extreme stress. The challenge was developing training scenarios realistic enough to prepare soldiers for actual combat conditions while maintaining safety standards and operational security. Traditional field exercises used predetermined scripts and predictable enemy actions. Real combat involved constant uncertainty, moral ambiguity, and consequences that extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations. Working with Captain Rodriguez and her team, we developed an innovative training approach that combined virtual reality technology, live role-playing scenarios, and psychological stress testing. Instead of fighting predetermined enemies in controlled environments, soldiers faced constantly changing scenarios that required them to adapt their tactics while making ethical decisions about civilian protection and intelligence gathering. The virtual reality component allowed us to create training environments that precisely replicated actual locations where military operations might occur. Soldiers could practice urban warfare techniques in simulated versions of real cities, complete with accurate building layouts, cultural dynamics, and population patterns. The psychological realism was unprecedented. Soldiers reported that VR training sessions produced stress levels comparable to actual combat operations. The live role-playing scenarios involved hiring professional actors to portray civilian populations, government officials, and insurgent operatives. Unlike traditional training where everyone understood their predetermined roles, these exercises featured genuine uncertainty about who could be trusted, what information was reliable, and how military actions might affect civilian populations. 6 months into developing the urban warfare program, we received an unexpected opportunity to test our concepts. The Army's Training and Doctrine Command announced that our battalion had been selected to conduct a demonstration for senior military leaders, including the Secretary of the Army and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The demonstration would showcase new training methodologies and potentially influence how the entire Army approached professional military education. The pressure was enormous. We had 4 weeks to prepare a comprehensive demonstration that would showcase urban warfare training, technology integration, and leadership development. Every aspect of our program would be evaluated by leaders who could approve widespread implementation or recommend fundamental changes that would require months of additional development. The demonstration scenario involved a complex urban environment where a company-sized unit had to establish security, gather intelligence about insurgent activities, and coordinate with civilian authorities while protecting non-combatant populations. The scenario deliberately included ethical dilemmas, communication breakdowns, and competing priorities that would test both individual decision-making and unit cohesion. As battalion commander, I had to balance multiple responsibilities during the demonstration. I needed to ensure that safety protocols were followed, that the training objectives were met, and that senior leaders understood the innovative aspects of our approach. More challenging, I had to demonstrate effective command presence while allowing company commanders to exercise tactical leadership without micromanagement. The day of the demonstration, Secretary of the Army Patricia Williams and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs General Marcus Johnson observed as our soldiers navigated through scenarios that pushed the boundaries of traditional military training. Virtual reality components allowed observers to experience the stress and complexity that soldiers face during decision-making exercises. Live role-playing scenarios demonstrated how cultural sensitivity and civilian interaction skills affected mission success. The climax of the demonstration involved a scenario where soldiers had to respond to a simulated terrorist attack while protecting civilian populations and gathering intelligence about additional threats. The exercise required coordination between multiple agencies, split-second decisions about rules of engagement, and adaptation to constantly changing circumstances. Secretary Williams observed as our soldiers successfully resolved the scenario through innovative tactics that prioritized civilian protection while maintaining operational effectiveness. After the demonstration, she approached me with questions about how the training methodologies could be scaled across the entire Army. Major Mitchell, she said, what I've seen today represents a fundamental evolution in military training. How do we ensure that these innovations reach soldiers throughout the Army, not just specialized training units? The question crystallized everything we'd been working toward. Ma'am, I replied, the key is developing train-the-trainer programs that allow experienced, non-commissioned officers and company commanders to implement these methodologies at their home stations. The technology components can be standardized and distributed, but the real innovation is in the training philosophy, preparing soldiers for complexity and uncertainty rather than predetermined scenarios. 3 weeks after the demonstration, we received notification that our urban warfare training program had been approved for Army-wide implementation. More significantly, I was selected to lead a task force responsible for developing implementation guidelines and training standards for the entire force. The assignment would require temporary duty at multiple installations, coordination with civilian technology contractors, and development of assessment criteria that could measure training effectiveness. The success of the urban warfare program led to expanded responsibilities for the battalion. We were tasked with developing training programs for cyber warfare integration, unmanned systems operations, and coalition operations with international partners. Each new mission required innovative approaches to challenges that traditional military education hadn't addressed. The cyber warfare program presented particularly complex challenges. Unlike traditional military operations where physical terrain and enemy capabilities could be observed and analyzed, cyber operations involved invisible threats that could affect military communications, weapons systems, and intelligence gathering without producing obvious indicators. Training soldiers to maintain operational effectiveness while defending against cyber attacks required completely new approaches to tactical decision-making. Working with civilian contractors and military intelligence specialists, we developed training scenarios where soldiers had to accomplish traditional military missions, while their communication systems, weapons targeting systems, and navigation equipment were systematically compromised by simulated cyber attacks. The training forced adaptation to equipment failures, communication breakdowns, and navigation challenges that closely replicated actual cyber warfare conditions. The Unmanned Systems program addressed the growing importance of drones, robotic systems, and autonomous vehicles in military operations. Traditional training treated these systems as specialized equipment operated by technical experts. Our program integrated unmanned systems into standard infantry operations, training every soldier to understand how autonomous systems could enhance tactical effectiveness while recognizing their limitations and vulnerabilities. By the end of my first year as battalion commander, the 1st Battalion, 29th Infantry had become the Army's premier training innovation unit. Our programs were being implemented at installations worldwide, our methodologies were being studied by military education specialists, and our soldiers were being selected for assignments throughout the Army based on their exposure to advanced training concepts. The personal cost of command was significant. 18-hour days were routine. Travel to multiple installations consumed weekends, and the pressure of developing training that would affect thousands of soldiers created constant stress. But the professional satisfaction was unprecedented. I was leading an organization that was genuinely changing how the Army prepared soldiers for modern conflicts. During my annual evaluation, Command Sergeant Major Thompson provided feedback that captured the essence of what we had accomplished. Ma'am, when you took command, some people wondered whether someone your age could lead this battalion. What you've proven is that innovative leadership doesn't depend on age or experience alone. It depends on vision, dedication, and the ability to inspire others to achieve things they didn't think possible. As I completed my first year of battalion command, General Morrison called with news that would shape the next phase of my career. Sarah, she said, your work at Benning has attracted attention at the highest levels of the Defense Department. The Secretary of Defense wants to discuss expanding your training innovations to all military services. There's also discussion about promoting you to Lieutenant Colonel and assigning you to develop training standards for the entire military. The opportunity represented validation of everything we had accomplished, but it also meant leaving operational command for staff responsibilities at the highest levels of military leadership. As I considered the offer, I realized that the crazy decision to enlist 8 years earlier had placed me at the center of debates about the future of military training and professional development. The 18-year-old who had left Millbrook, Ohio, determined to prove herself, was about to influence how every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine would be trained for future conflicts. But the most challenging tests of leadership were still ahead. The Pentagon's E-ring in November felt like the epicenter of American military power, where decisions made in windowless conference rooms could affect global stability within hours. As the newly promoted Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, I walked through corridors lined with portraits of previous defense secretaries, knowing that my assignment to the office of the Secretary of Defense would place me at the intersection of military strategy and national policy in ways I had never imagined possible. My new position as Director of Advanced Training Concepts reported directly to Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness Dr. Amanda Foster, a former Air Force colonel who had transitioned to civilian leadership after completing her own groundbreaking work in military education reform. The office occupied prime real estate in the Pentagon's most secure section, with classified briefing rooms, direct communication links to combatant commands worldwide, and access to intelligence assessments that shaped American military posture across 6 continents. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, Dr. Foster began during our first meeting. Your work at Fort Benning has created ripple effects throughout the Department of Defense. The training methodologies you developed are being studied by every military service, and preliminary assessments suggest they could revolutionize how we prepare forces for modern conflicts. She gestured toward a wall-mounted display showing global military deployments. But innovation in peacetime is different from innovation under pressure. Your real test will come when these training concepts have to work in actual crisis situations, with real consequences for American interests and alliance relationships. The scope of my new responsibilities was staggering. I would oversee training standardization across all military services, coordinate with international partners on joint training exercises, and develop rapid response protocols for emerging threats that didn't fit traditional military categories. The position required understanding not just military tactics and strategy, but also international law, diplomatic protocols, and the complex relationships between military actions and political objectives. My first major project involved developing training standards for multinational coalition operations. Recent conflicts had demonstrated that American military forces increasingly operated alongside allies with different training standards, communication procedures, and rules of engagement. The lack of standardized protocols had led to coordination failures, friendly fire incidents, and political complications that undermined mission effectiveness. Working with liaison officers from NATO allies, Pacific partners, and strategic cooperation agreements, I led a team that analyzed every major coalition operation from the past decade. The research revealed consistent patterns. Successful coalition operations required not just compatible equipment and communication systems, but also shared understanding of tactical procedures, decision-making processes, and cultural considerations that affected how different militaries approached common challenges. The solution we developed was a comprehensive international military cooperation protocol that established baseline training requirements for all coalition operations. Instead of expecting allied forces to adapt American procedures or Americans to learn each ally's methods, we created universal standards that drew from the best practices of all participating militaries. The protocol's first test came sooner than anyone expected. In February, a humanitarian crisis in the Pacific region required immediate military response from a coalition including American, Australian, Japanese, and Philippine forces. Massive flooding had displaced over 2 million people, overwhelmed local governments, and created security challenges that required coordinated military intervention for disaster relief, refugee protection, and infrastructure restoration. Dr. Foster called me into her office at 03:00 on a Tuesday morning. "Sarah," she said, "the President has authorized military support for Pacific flood relief operations. You have 6 hours to develop deployment recommendations for a multinational task force using your new cooperation protocols." This is exactly the kind of scenario your training standards were designed to address. The crisis required coordinating military assets from 4 different countries, with varying capabilities, legal restrictions, and political objectives. American forces could provide airlift capacity and logistical support, but political considerations limited their operational areas. Australian forces had specialized disaster relief equipment, but required specific legal frameworks for operations outside their territory. Japanese self-defense forces possessed advanced communication systems, but faced constitutional restrictions on certain military activities. Philippine forces understood local conditions and language, but needed additional resources for large-scale operations. Using the International Military Cooperation Protocol, I developed a deployment plan that maximized each nation's capabilities while respecting their limitations. American transport aircraft would move equipment and personnel, Australian disaster relief specialists would coordinate refugee assistance, Japanese communication systems would provide command and control, and Philippine forces would serve as primary interface with local populations. The operation launched 72 hours after initial deployment authorization. For the first time in recent memory, a multinational military operation began with all participating forces already trained in compatible procedures, equipped with interoperable communication systems, and operating under shared tactical doctrine. I deployed to the operational theater as the coalition's training coordination officer, responsible for ensuring that the theoretical protocols we had developed actually worked under field conditions. The experience of coordinating 4 different militaries during active humanitarian operations provided insights that no peacetime exercise could have replicated. The challenges were immediate and complex. Cultural differences in leadership styles meant that direct orders expected by American forces might be considered disrespectful by Japanese units. Australian disaster relief procedures emphasized civilian safety considerations that sometimes conflicted with Philippine forces' focus on rapid response. Japanese communication protocols prioritized precision and consensus building that slowed decision-making when American forces expected immediate action. But the International Military Cooperation Protocol provided frameworks for resolving these differences. Instead of each force operating independently or one nation dominating coalition operations, the shared training standards allowed real-time adaptation and problem-solving. When communication breakdowns occurred, all forces understood backup procedures. When tactical situations required rapid reorganization, everyone operated from common understanding of command relationships and decision-making authority. Over 6 weeks of operations, the coalition evacuated 800,000 displaced civilians, restored essential infrastructure to 12 major population centers, and established security conditions that allowed civilian authorities to resume normal operations. More significantly, the operation proved that standardized training could enable genuinely effective multinational military cooperation. The success of Pacific relief operations attracted international attention. NATO headquarters requested briefings on the cooperation protocols. The United Nations Peacekeeping Department asked for consultation on training standards for international peacekeeping forces. Military education institutions from allied nations sent students to study the training methodologies we had developed, but the most significant recognition came from Secretary of Defense Williams herself. 2 months after returning from the Pacific deployment, I received a call requesting my immediate presence in her office. Secretary Williams was meeting with General Johnson, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and Admiral Patricia Morrison, who had been promoted to lead U.S. Pacific Command. Colonel Mitchell, Secretary Williams began, the Pacific Coalition operation has been analyzed by every major military power. The operational effectiveness achieved through standardized training protocols represents a fundamental advancement in alliance cooperation. We need to discuss how these concepts can be expanded and implemented globally. General Johnson leaned forward. Sarah, what you've accomplished goes beyond training innovation. You've demonstrated that effective military cooperation requires understanding not just tactics and technology, but also cultural dynamics, political considerations, and international legal frameworks. That's the kind of comprehensive thinking we need for the challenges ahead. Admiral Morrison added her perspective. The Pacific region faces increasing security challenges that will require sustained coalition operations. China's military modernization, North Korea's weapons programs, and territorial disputes throughout the region all demand coordinated responses from allied forces. Your training protocols could be the foundation for maintaining stability in the most strategically important region of the world. The conversation revealed the scope of what they were proposing. Instead of limiting my work to training standardization, they wanted me to develop comprehensive protocols for all aspects of coalition military operations: intelligence sharing, logistics coordination, political military integration, and strategic planning. The assignment would require promotion to full colonel and establishment of a new Pentagon office dedicated to international military cooperation. There's one more consideration, Secretary Williams added. This position would make you the youngest colonel in the active military and place you in direct contact with defense ministers, military leaders, and heads of state from allied nations. The visibility and responsibility would be unprecedented for someone with your experience level. As I considered their proposal, I reflected on the path that had brought me to this moment. 9 years earlier, I had been an 18-year-old from Ohio whose decision to enlist had been considered crazy by family and friends. Now I was being offered responsibility for developing military cooperation protocols that could affect global security. "Ma'am," I replied, "I understand the magnitude of what you're proposing. I also understand that effective leadership at this level requires not just military expertise, but also diplomatic skills and strategic thinking that I'm still developing. If you believe I can grow into these responsibilities, I'm honored to accept the challenge." The promotion ceremony to full colonel took place 3 weeks later, with my parents attending their 4th military ceremony in 9 years. The contrast with my initial enlistment was striking. Instead of a family worried about their daughter making a terrible mistake, they now watched with pride as their daughter assumed responsibilities that would affect international security. The new Office of International Military Cooperation began operations in September, with a staff of 12 officers representing all military services and liaison positions from 8 allied nations. Our mission was to develop and implement cooperation protocols for every aspect of multinational military operations, from basic training standards to strategic planning procedures. The office's first major test came in December, when intelligence indicated that terrorist organizations were planning coordinated attacks against Western targets in multiple countries. The threat required unprecedented cooperation between military and civilian security agencies from the United States, United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Australia. Previous counterterrorism operations had been hampered by incompatible intelligence sharing procedures, conflicting legal authorities, and cultural differences in operational approaches. Each nation's security forces operated under different rules of engagement, communication protocols, and command structures that made coordination difficult and sometimes dangerous. Using the cooperation protocols we had developed, I coordinated a response that allowed 5 nations' security forces to operate as a unified command while respecting each country's sovereignty and legal requirements. The operation successfully disrupted the planned attacks and led to arrests in 12 cities across 3 continents. The counterterrorism success established the Office of International Military Cooperation as an essential component of American national security infrastructure. Military leaders from allied nations began requesting regular consultation on cooperation protocols. Defense ministers included our recommendations in international security agreements. Academic institutions asked for research partnerships to study the theoretical foundations of multinational military cooperation. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from General Morrison, who had become a mentor and advocate throughout my career progression. During my annual evaluation, she provided feedback that captured the essence of what we had accomplished. "Sarah," she said, "when I first met you as a captain in the Strategic Planning Division, I saw potential for exceptional achievement. What you've accomplished over the past 3 years has exceeded even those high expectations. You've not only demonstrated exceptional military leadership, but you've also proven that innovation and strategic thinking can be developed through experience, education, and dedication to continuous improvement." She continued, quote, "More importantly, You've shown that effective leadership at the strategic level requires understanding how military capabilities serve broader political objectives. That understanding, combined with your operational experience and commitment to excellence, suggests that you're ready for the highest levels of military responsibility. As my third year at the Pentagon concluded, I received notification that would reshape my understanding of what was possible in a military career. The President had nominated me for promotion to Brigadier General, which would make me the youngest general officer in the active military and position me for responsibilities that would directly influence American national security policy. The nomination required Senate confirmation, public hearings, and scrutiny from political leaders who would evaluate whether someone with my background and experience could handle the responsibilities of general officer rank. But as I prepared for the confirmation process, I felt the same confidence that had sustained me through every previous challenge, the certainty that the crazy decision to enlist had placed me exactly where I belonged. The Hart Senate office building in March felt like a different kind of battlefield, where political warfare replaced kinetic operations, but the stakes remained equally high. As I sat in the anteroom outside the Senate Armed Services Committee hearing room, waiting for my confirmation hearing to begin, I understood that the next 3 hours would determine whether a decade of military service would culminate in historic promotion or public rejection by the very government I had sworn to serve. Senator Margaret Hayes, the committee chairwoman and former Navy officer herself, had requested extensive documentation of every decision I had made during my career. The committee's minority leader, Senator Thomas Richardson, had publicly questioned whether someone with only 10 years of service could possess the experience necessary for general officer responsibilities. The hearing would be broadcast live, analyzed by military affairs commentators, and scrutinized by active duty and retired military leaders, whose opinions could shape my future effectiveness even if confirmed. My preparation had been exhaustive. 3 weeks of mock hearings with Pentagon staff, detailed briefings on every policy issue the committee might address, and consultation with retired general officers who had undergone similar confirmation processes. But no amount of preparation could eliminate the fundamental challenge: defending a career trajectory that violated every traditional expectation about military advancement. Dr. Foster had flown back from overseas assignments to attend the hearing. General Morrison had submitted written testimony supporting my nomination. Even Command Sergeant Major Thompson, now serving as the senior enlisted advisor to the Army Chief of Staff, had provided a statement emphasizing my leadership effectiveness during battalion command. The support was unprecedented, but so was the criticism from military traditionalists, who viewed rapid promotion as undermining the experience-based promotion system that had served the military for decades. The hearing room was packed with military affairs reporters, retired officers, and congressional staff when Senator Hayes called the session to order at 1,000 hours. The formal atmosphere reminded me of courts-martial I had observed, the same sense that institutional credibility was at stake, the same careful attention to protocol and precedent. "Colonel Mitchell," Senator Hayes began, "your nomination represents the youngest general officer promotion in modern military history. Please explain to this committee why someone with 10 years of service should be entrusted with responsibilities typically reserved for officers with twice that experience." The question was direct and fundamental. My answer would establish the framework for everything that followed. "Pouki the Bowenki." "Senator Hayes," I replied, "military effectiveness has never been determined solely by years of service, but by the ability to adapt to changing circumstances, make sound decisions under pressure, and inspire others to achieve objectives that serve our national interests. My career has provided opportunities to develop these capabilities through combat leadership, strategic education, innovation in military training, and coordination of international military operations." I continued, drawing on examples from military history. Throughout American military history, our most effective leaders have been those who combined experience with innovation. Officers like Matthew Ridgway, who revolutionized airborne operations, or Norman Schwarzkopf, who developed new approaches to coalition warfare. The challenges facing our military today require leaders who understand both traditional military principles and emerging security environments. Senator Richardson leaned forward, his skepticism evident. "Colonel Mitchell, critics argue that your rapid advancement represents a departure from merit-based promotion in favor of political correctness or media attention. How do you respond to suggestions that your gender and age have influenced your career progression more than your actual performance? The question was designed to provoke defensive anger, but I had anticipated it during preparation sessions. My response needed to acknowledge the criticism while redirecting attention to objective measures of performance. Senator Richardson, I said, every promotion I have received has been based on quantifiable performance metrics, combat effectiveness ratings, training innovation outcomes, strategic planning contributions, and leadership evaluations from subordinates, peers, and superiors. These evaluations are available for committee review and speak for themselves. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. Gender and age are immutable characteristics that don't affect decision-making ability, tactical competence, or strategic thinking. What matters is whether someone can accomplish missions, develop subordinates, and contribute to our national defense. My record demonstrates consistent achievement in each of these areas. Senator Hayes nodded approvingly, then shifted to more substantive policy questions. Colonel Mitchell, your work on international military cooperation has attracted global attention. How do these protocols affect American military independence and decision-making authority? This question addressed genuine policy concerns about whether standardized cooperation procedures might constrain American operational flexibility. My answer needed to demonstrate understanding of both military effectiveness and political implications. Senator Hayes, I replied, effective international cooperation actually enhances American influence by making our allies more capable partners rather than dependent clients. When Allied forces can operate effectively alongside American units, it multiplies our collective capabilities while reducing the burden on American resources. I elaborated with specific examples. During the Pacific humanitarian operation, standardized cooperation protocols allowed 4 nations to achieve objectives that would have required significantly larger American forces operating independently. The investment in cooperation training reduces long-term costs while strengthening alliance relationships that serve broader strategic objectives. The hearing continued for 2.5 hours, covering everything from defense budget priorities to emerging threats in cyberspace and outer space. Each question tested different aspects of my knowledge and judgment, forcing me to demonstrate understanding of issues far beyond my direct experience, while maintaining credibility about the limitations of that experience. The most challenging moment came when Senator Richardson asked about my long-term career goals and whether rapid promotion might create unrealistic expectations for future advancement. Colonel Mitchell, he said, if confirmed as Brigadier General at 32, you would have nearly 30 years remaining in your career. How do we ensure that accelerated early promotion doesn't create pressures for continued rapid advancement that might compromise the institution's promotion system? The question reflected genuine institutional concerns about precedent and fairness. My answer needed to address these concerns while articulating a realistic vision for continued service. Senator Richardson, I replied, promotion is a responsibility, not an entitlement. Future advancement should depend entirely on performance in each assignment, contribution to national defense, and the military's needs at any given time. Rapid early promotion creates obligations to demonstrate exceptional performance, not expectations for continued acceleration. I continued, my goal is to serve effectively at whatever rank and position best serves our national interests. Whether that involves continued advancement or extended service at current levels, matters less than ensuring our military remains capable of defending American interests and supporting our allies. Following my testimony, the committee heard from supporting witnesses including Dr. Foster, retired Admiral Patricia Stevens, and Dr. Elizabeth Warren from Columbia University. Each provided perspectives on my qualifications, performance, and potential for effective service as a general officer. Dr. Foster's testimony proved particularly compelling. Senators, she said, Colonel Mitchell represents exactly the kind of officer our military needs for 21st century challenges. Someone who combines tactical competence with strategic thinking, operational experience with academic rigor, and American military traditions with international cooperation capabilities. The committee's final questions addressed implementation details. Assuming confirmation, what would be my first priorities as a general officer? How would I balance competing demands on my time and attention? In what measures of success should Congress use to evaluate my performance? 3 weeks after the hearing, Senator Hayes called to inform me that the committee had voted 18-4 to recommend confirmation, with 2 abstentions. The full Senate vote was scheduled for the following week, with confirmation considered likely based on the committee's recommendation. The Senate confirmation vote took place on a Thursday afternoon, with minimal debate and a final tally of 78-19 in favor. The margin was comfortable, though the negative votes reminded me that substantial skepticism remained about my qualifications and the precedent my promotion represented. My promotion ceremony to Brigadier General was held at the Pentagon on May 15th, with Secretary Williams presiding and my parents, family, and mentors in attendance. As the single star was pinned to my uniform, I thought about the 18-year-old who had left Millbrook, Ohio 12 years earlier, determined to prove that enlisting wasn't a crazy decision. The promotion came with assignment as Deputy Commanding General of the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The 82nd was America's premier rapid deployment force, capable of deploying anywhere in the world within 18 hours of notification. As Deputy Commander, I would be responsible for training, readiness, and operational planning for 20,000 paratroopers, while serving as the division's senior representative for interagency and international cooperation. Major General Robert Martinez, the division commander, was a 30-year veteran who had led combat operations in every major conflict since the Gulf War. During our first meeting, he outlined expectations that reflected both the opportunities and challenges of my new position. "General Mitchell," he said, "the 82nd Airborne Division has a unique mission requiring exceptional readiness for rapid deployment to any global crisis. Your experience with international cooperation protocols and training innovation will be valuable assets, but you'll also need to understand the specific culture and operational requirements of airborne forces." He continued, "This division has been led by some of the Army's most distinguished officers. The soldiers expect excellence from their leadership, and they have the experience to recognize whether their commanders understand the unique demands of airborne operations. The assignment required mastering entirely new operational concepts. Airborne operations involved complexities of aircraft coordination, parachute insertion, and rapid assembly in hostile territory that I had never experienced directly. The 82nd's mission, as America's primary rapid response force, meant constant readiness for deployment to global crisis situations with minimal advance warning. My first major test came 2 months after assuming the deputy commander position. Intelligence indicated that a terrorist organization was planning attacks against American diplomatic facilities in 3 African nations simultaneously. The coordinated threat required immediate deployment of specialized forces capable of protecting American personnel while working with local security forces to neutralize the terrorist networks. The operation, designated Guardian Shield, would involve deploying elements of the 82nd Airborne Division to 3 different countries within 72 hours, coordinating with State Department security personnel, and establishing security perimeters around American embassies while maintaining diplomatic relationships with host nations. As Deputy Commander, I was responsible for operational planning, logistics coordination, and international cooperation protocols. The mission required balancing military effectiveness with diplomatic considerations, ensuring that American military operations supported rather than complicated broader foreign policy objectives. The deployment began at 03:00 on a Tuesday morning, with transport aircraft carrying paratroopers and equipment to 3 different continents simultaneously. Communication coordination proved critical, as forces in Africa, Asia, and South America needed to synchronize their operations while adapting to local conditions and legal requirements. The international cooperation protocols I had developed at the Pentagon proved invaluable. Instead of each deployment operating independently, shared communication systems and standardized procedures allowed real-time coordination between geographically separated forces. When political complications arose in one location, successful approaches from other deployments could be quickly adapted and implemented. Over 6 weeks of operations, Guardian Shield successfully protected American diplomatic personnel, prevented terrorist attacks in 3 countries, and established security cooperation agreements that strengthened long-term American relationships with regional partners. More importantly, the operation demonstrated that rapid deployment forces could achieve strategic objectives through coordination and cooperation rather than overwhelming force alone. The success of Guardian Shield attracted attention from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and National Security Council. My role in planning and executing the operation established me as someone capable of translating strategic objectives into effective operational plans, while managing the complex political and diplomatic considerations that surrounded modern military operations. 6 months after assuming my position with the 82nd Airborne, I received a call from General Johnson, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. "Sarah," he said, "your work at Bragg has confirmed what we hoped when we recommended your promotion. You're ready for the next level of responsibility, leading your own major command." The opportunity he described would make me the youngest major general in American military history and place me in command of a joint task force responsible for developing military responses to emerging global threats. It was exactly the kind of challenge that the crazy decision to enlist had been preparing me for all along. The ceremony at Joint Base Andrews on a crisp October morning marked more than just another promotion. It represented the culmination of a journey that had begun with an 18-year-old's decision to reject conventional expectations and pursue something that everyone around her had called impossible. As Secretary of Defense Williams prepared to pin the second star on my uniform, making me Major General Sarah Mitchell at 32 years old, I reflected on the path that had brought me from a small town in Ohio to commanding 15,000 soldiers and shaping the future of American military operations. The assignment that came with promotion to Major General was unprecedented: Commanding General of the Joint Task Force for Advanced Military Operations, a newly created organization responsible for developing, testing, and implementing revolutionary approaches to 21st-century warfare. Based at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, the task force would operate as a laboratory for military innovation, combining the best minds from all service branches with cutting-edge technology and unlimited authority to challenge traditional military doctrine. President Jennifer Martinez herself had attended the promotion ceremony, emphasizing the national significance of the task force's mission. "General Mitchell," she said during her remarks, "the challenges facing our nation require military leaders who can think beyond conventional approaches while maintaining the fundamental values that make our armed forces the finest in the world. Your career represents exactly the kind of innovative leadership our country needs." The task force's first major assignment came directly from the National Security Council, developing comprehensive response capabilities for hybrid warfare threats that combined conventional military operations with cyber attacks, information warfare, economic manipulation, and political interference. Traditional military responses were inadequate for adversaries who could attack American interests without conventional military forces crossing international borders. My staff included brilliant officers from every service branch, civilian analysts from leading think tanks, technology specialists from Silicon Valley, and international partners from allied nations. Colonel Jennifer Walsh, my former bunkmate from basic training who had developed expertise in information warfare, served as my deputy commander. Command Sergeant Major Thompson, who had followed my career from battalion command through Pentagon assignments, became the task force's senior enlisted advisor. "Ma'am," Sergeant Major Thompson said during our first staff meeting, "what you're being asked to do here goes beyond military innovation. You're essentially redefining what military operations look like when traditional battlefields don't exist, and enemies can attack without declaring war or revealing their identities." The challenge was immense. How do you develop military responses to adversaries who could disrupt electrical grids through cyber attacks, manipulate social media to undermine political cohesion, and coordinate economic pressures that weakened alliance relationships? Traditional military training emphasized kinetic operations against identifiable enemies in defined geographic areas. Hybrid warfare involved invisible enemies conducting attacks that might not be recognized as warfare until irreversible damage had been done. Working with technology partners, we developed simulation systems that could model hybrid warfare scenarios with unprecedented realism. Instead of traditional war games involving military units maneuvering against each other, our exercises included cyber attack simulations, social media manipulation campaigns, and economic warfare elements that tested military leaders' ability to coordinate responses across multiple domains simultaneously. The breakthrough came during our third major exercise, when we successfully demonstrated integrated responses to a simulated attack that combined cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, disinformation campaigns, targeting alliance relationships, and conventional military threats in 3 different regions. The exercise proved that military forces could effectively counter hybrid threats through coordinated operations that combine traditional military capabilities with cyber warfare, information operations, and strategic communication. 6 months into leading the task force, I received intelligence that would provide the ultimate test of our capabilities. A hostile nation was conducting exactly the kind of hybrid warfare operation we had been preparing to counter: cyber attacks against American financial systems, disinformation campaigns designed to undermine confidence in democratic institutions, and military buildups near allied nations that suggested preparation for conventional operations. The National Security Council authorized Operation Digital Shield, the first real-world implementation of hybrid warfare countermeasures. As overall commander, I coordinated responses that involved cyber warfare specialists defending critical infrastructure, information operations teams countering disinformation campaigns, and conventional military forces demonstrating American commitment to allied security. The operation required coordination between military commands, intelligence agencies, private sector technology companies, and international partners. Traditional military command structures weren't designed for this level of complexity, requiring new approaches to decision-making, resource allocation, and operational coordination. Over 18 months, Digital Shield successfully neutralized cyber threats, exposed and countered disinformation operations, and deterred conventional military aggression through coordinated alliance responses. The operation established new precedents for international cooperation in addressing hybrid threats, and demonstrated that innovative military concepts could translate into effective real-world operations. The success of Digital Shield transformed the Joint Task Force for Advanced Military Operations from an experimental organization into a permanent component of American national security infrastructure. Military leaders from allied nations requested training in hybrid warfare countermeasures. Academic institutions established research partnerships to study the theoretical foundations of multi-domain operations. Defense contractors developed new technologies specifically designed to support integrated warfare concepts. But perhaps the most significant recognition came from an unexpected source. My father, now 71 and fully retired from the hardware store, called me after reading about Digital Shield in the newspaper. "Sarah," he said, "I want to apologize for something I've regretted for 14 years. When you told us you were enlisting instead of going to college, I thought you were making a terrible mistake. I was wrong. You weren't running away from your potential. You were running towards something none of us could have imagined." He continued, "Your mother and I have been reading about what you've accomplished, about the soldiers you've led, and the operations you've planned. We understand now that the military wasn't a backup plan for you. It was your calling, and you were right to pursue it despite our doubts." The conversation crystallized something I had been thinking about throughout my career: the importance of following authentic paths despite external expectations or conventional wisdom. The decision to enlist had seemed crazy to everyone around me, but it had led to opportunities that wouldn't have existed through any other route. 3 years after assuming command of the Joint Task Force, I received a call from Secretary Williams that would cap my career in ways I never could have anticipated. "Sarah," she said, "the President wants to discuss a special assignment that would combine your military experience with broader national security responsibilities. Are you interested in transitioning to civilian leadership?" The opportunity was unprecedented. Deputy Secretary of Defense, the second highest position in the Department of Defense, traditionally held by experienced civilians with extensive policy backgrounds. Taking the position would require leaving active military service but would provide opportunities to influence national security policy at the highest levels of government. As I considered the offer, I thought about the 18-year-old who had left Millbrook, Ohio, determined to prove that enlisting wasn't a crazy decision. That young woman had wanted to serve something bigger than herself, to test her capabilities against the highest standards, and to make a meaningful contribution to national defense. 14 years later, I had commanded soldiers in combat, developed training programs that influenced military education worldwide, coordinated international military operations that strengthened alliance relationships, and led innovation efforts that shaped how America responded to emerging security threats. The crazy decision to enlist had led to exactly the kind of meaningful service I had hoped for, though the specific path had been impossible to predict. I accepted the deputy secretary position, retiring from active duty as a major general after 14 years of service that had redefined what was possible in a military career. The retirement ceremony at the Pentagon was attended by soldiers I had led, mentors who had developed my capabilities, and family members who had watched me transform from a restless teenager into someone capable of influencing national security at the highest levels. Command Sergeant Major Thompson, who had followed my career from battalion command through task force leadership, provided the most meaningful tribute. "Ma'am, when I first met you as a young major taking command of a training battalion, I wondered whether someone so young could handle the responsibilities of leadership. What I learned was that effective leadership isn't about age or experience alone. It's about vision, integrity, and the ability to inspire others to achieve things they didn't think possible." He continued. "You've shown thousands of soldiers that excellence comes from dedication to continuous improvement, that innovation comes from understanding fundamental principles well enough to adapt them to new challenges, and that leadership comes from genuine care for the people you're privileged to serve. That's a legacy that will influence military leadership for generations." As I transitioned to civilian leadership, I often reflected on the moment 14 years earlier when I had driven away from Millbrook, watching my hometown disappear in the rearview mirror. The journey from that small town to the Pentagon had required constant adaptation, continuous learning, and willingness to challenge assumptions about what was possible. The people who had called me crazy for enlisting hadn't been malicious. They had been trying to protect me from what they saw as a risky decision that might limit my opportunities. What they couldn't have understood was that some opportunities only become available through paths that initially seem impossible. Today, as Deputy Secretary of Defense, I work on national security challenges that require exactly the kind of comprehensive thinking that military service had developed. The ability to balance competing priorities, make decisions with incomplete information, and coordinate complex operations involving multiple agencies and international partners. Young people often ask me about the decision to enlist instead of following a conventional college path. My advice is always the same. Understand your authentic interests and capabilities, research the paths that lead where you want to go, and be willing to pursue unconventional approaches if they align with your goals. The military provided opportunities that matched my interests in leadership, strategy, and service to something larger than individual advancement. But the specific path, from enlisted soldier to general officer, was possible only because I was willing to work harder than seemed reasonable, learn continuously from every experience, and maintain integrity even when compromise would have been easier. Most importantly, I learned that crazy decisions aren't always wrong decisions. Sometimes they're the only decisions that lead to extraordinary outcomes. The 18-year-old who left Millbrook, Ohio, determined to prove herself, was right about one thing. The conventional path wasn't going to provide the challenges and opportunities she needed to become who she was meant to be. 14 years later, that crazy decision to enlist had led to commanding 15,000 soldiers, developing military doctrine that influenced global security, and serving at the highest levels of American national defense leadership. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is trust your instincts about your own potential, even when everyone around you thinks you're crazy for trying. The girl from Ohio who everyone thought was making a terrible mistake had become exactly who she was supposed to be, and it all started with the decision to enlist when everyone expected her to go to college. Sometimes crazy is just another word for visionary. Kel. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.